the first gunshot of the evening tore through the tense quiet of Concordia, Texas. But Mabel Nolan didn't flinch anymore. 5 years of serving whiskey to cowboys and gamblers in Elijah Warner's Silverado Saloon had beaten the startle reflex out of her, leaving behind a woman whose hands remained steady even as chaos erupted at the poker tables. "You cheating son of a bitch." A red-faced cattle driver lurched to his feet, knocking his chair backward as he aimed his pistol at a slick-dressed gambler. The second shot splintered wood above the bar mirror, sending patrons diving for cover. Mabel merely ducked slightly, continuing to polish glasses as if nothing more than a summer breeze had disturbed the evening. "Mabel, get these gentlemen another round. On the house." Elijah Warner's voice carried across the saloon floor, smooth as expensive bourbon and twice as dangerous. The saloon owner appeared from his office, impeccably dressed as always in his tailored black suit, gold watch chain glinting in the lamplight. He laid a heavy hand on the cattle driver's shoulder. "Now, Mr. Collins, I'm sure we can settle this without further ventilation of my establishment." Mabel moved to fill the order, knowing that Warner's generosity wasn't generosity at all. Every free drink, every courtesy was meticulously recorded in his leather-bound ledger, the same ledger that held the mounting debt that kept her chained to this place, as surely as if she wore iron shackles. "Need help with those?" Mary, one of the newer girls, appeared beside her, eyes still wide from the gunshots. "I've got it," Mabel replied, arranging whiskey glasses on her tray. "You should see to table 3. Those cattle buyers from Austin are feeling generous tonight." Mary nodded gratefully and hurried away. At 22, Mabel was only a few years older than Mary, but sometimes she felt ancient, worn down by the weight of her circumstances, and the knowledge that each passing day only deepened her entrapment. She delivered the drinks, weaving between tables with practiced grace, ignoring the wandering hands and lewd comments. Her cornflower blue dress, one Warner had generously provided, adding its considerable cost to her debt, swished around her ankles as she moved. The low neckline that Warner insisted upon earned her better tips, but every coin went straight into his palm at night's end, supposedly reducing her obligation to him. Stepping back behind the bar, Mabel checked the large, ornate clock. 4 more hours until closing. 4 more hours of this theater of desperation. Where men spent money they couldn't afford to lose, and women like her paid debts they could never hope to escape. The batwing doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of October wind and the silhouette of a man Mabel had never seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered, he paused in the entrance, scanning the room with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to measuring threats. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard. Dust covered his clothes, marking him as a traveler rather than a local. He moved toward the bar with an unhurried confidence, his spurs making a soft musical jingle with each step. Removing his hat, he revealed tousled dark blonde hair and eyes the color of a summer sky after rain. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Might I trouble you for a whiskey?" "Of course," Mabel replied, reaching for a glass and the bottle of decent but not their best whiskey that Warner instructed they serve to strangers. "The good stuff, if you don't mind," the stranger said with the hint of a smile. "Been a long ride." Mabel hesitated, then reached for the bottle on the top shelf. "That'll be $2. He placed a $5 gold piece on the bar. "Keep it full until that runs out." As she poured, Mabel studied him more carefully. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality. A gun belt hung low on his hip, the holster tied down, the mark of someone who knew how to use his weapon but wasn't looking to prove it. Most telling was the way he watched the room in the bar mirror while appearing to focus on his drink, the habit of a man who'd learned the hard way to keep his back covered. "You passing through or staying in Concordia?" she asked, curious despite herself. "Depends on what I find here," he answered, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Name's Thomas Xavier. Most folks call me Trace. Mabel Nolan." She extended her hand automatically, then realized the impropriety of the gesture. To her surprise, he took it gently, giving it a brief but respectful shake. "Pleasure, Miss Nolan. You been working in this establishment long?" Something in his tone made her wonder if there was more behind the question than casual conversation. "5 years. Since I was 17. He nodded slowly, his eyes briefly darkening before he took another sip of whiskey. "Thomas Xavier," Warner's voice boomed from across the room as the saloon owner approached with his hand extended. "I heard you might be coming to Concordia. Your reputation precedes you, sir." Trace stood, accepting Warner's handshake with a measured nod. "Mr. Warner, word travels fast. In my business, it pays to know who's coming and going. What brings you to our little corner of Texas?" "Looking to settle some business," Trace replied, his expression revealing nothing. "Well, any business you need to conduct, I'm your man," Warner said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Mabel, make sure Mr. Xavier gets whatever he wants on the house." Mabel felt her stomach tighten, another generosity to be added to her account, no doubt. "No need," Trace said firmly. "I pay my own way." Warner's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Just being neighborly to a man of your standing." After Warner moved away to greet other patrons, Trace turned back to Mabel. "He seems mighty interested in making a good impression." "Mr. Warner believes in cultivating profitable relationships," Mabel said carefully, aware that the walls in Concordia had ears, and most of them reported back to her employer. "And what does Mr. Warner believe about his employees?" Trace asked quietly, his eyes meeting hers directly. Mabel froze, the glass she was polishing suspended in midair. "I wouldn't presume to know Mr. Warner's mind," she replied, the practiced answer slipping out automatically. "No, I don't suppose you would," Trace said. He finished his drink and set the glass down gently. "But I'm curious about how a 17-year-old girl came to work in a place like this, and why she's still here 5 years later." The question struck too close to truths Mabel kept buried deep. "It's getting busy, Mr. Xavier. If you'll excuse me." She moved away to serve other customers, feeling his eyes follow her. For the rest of the evening, she was acutely aware of his presence as he nursed his drinks, occasionally exchanging words with other patrons, but mostly watching her, watching Warner, watching the complex dance of commerce and desperation that played out nightly in the Silverado. By closing time, Trace Xavier was one of the last customers remaining. Warner approached his table, and though Mabel couldn't hear their conversation, the intensity of their exchange was evident in Warner's animated gestures and Trace's measured responses. "Mabel," Warner called out as the final stragglers departed. "Come to my office after you've finished cleaning up. We need to discuss your accounts." These discussions always ended the same way, with Warner explaining how her debt had somehow grown despite her work, with new expenses for room, board, dresses, the broken glass from 3 weeks ago, the customer she'd supposedly offended last month who'd taken his business elsewhere. Trace stood, settling his hat on his head. At the door he paused, looking back at her. "Good night, Miss Nolan," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now empty saloon. "I expect I'll see you tomorrow." The statement held a weight beyond its simple words, almost like a promise. After he'd gone, Mabel finished her cleaning with mechanical efficiency, her mind racing. Who was Thomas Xavier, and why did he seem so interested in her situation? More importantly, what had he and Warner discussed so intently? Warner was waiting in his office, the leather-bound ledger open before him on the massive oak desk that dominated the room. The office, like everything about Elijah Warner, was designed to intimidate, from the mounted steer horns on the wall to the glass case displaying various firearms. "Close the door," he instructed without looking up. Mabel obeyed, standing with her hands clasped before her. "Interesting man, Thomas Xavier," Warner said, finally raising his eyes to her. "Do you know who he is?" "No, sir. He said he's looking to settle some business." Warner's laugh held no humor. "That's one way of putting it. Xavier is what you might call a problem solver for wealthy interests back east. Banks, railroad companies, mining operations. When they have complications in their expansion efforts, they send men like Xavier." Mabel remained silent, uncertain why Warner was sharing this information. "He seems quite taken with you," Warner continued, his tone hardening. "Made several inquiries about your circumstances." Fear prickled along Mabel's spine. "I barely spoke to him, Mr. Warner." "See that it stays that way." Warner flipped through his ledger. "Now, regarding your accounts, I've had to add several items this week. The broken mirror, that was from the gunshot." "I wasn't anywhere near it," Mabel protested, immediately regretting the interruption when she saw Warner's expression darken. "My establishment, my rules," he said coldly. "The damage occurred during your shift. Additionally, there's the matter of the wine you spilled on Mrs. Henderson's dress last Tuesday." "That wasn't," she stopped herself, knowing it was futile. "Yes, sir." Warner made a show of calculating figures on a sheet of paper. "Your current debt stands at $1,287.42. With your wages and tips being applied, you managed to reduce it by almost $3 this week." He smiled thinly. "At this rate, you'll be free and clear in, oh, about 8 more years." The number hit Mabel like a physical blow. 8 more years. She'd be 30 before she could leave this place. "Unless, of course," Warner added, leaning forward, "you'd consider other arrangements that might expedite your repayment." Mabel knew exactly what arrangements he meant. It was an offer he'd made with increasing frequency over the past year, especially after his wife had passed away. Thus far, she'd managed to refuse without triggering his wrath, but each refusal made the next more dangerous. "I'm content with our current arrangement, Mr. Warner," she said carefully, his expression hardened. "Are you? Because Xavier seemed mighty interested in your contentment. I would hate for him to get the wrong impression about how I run my business." The threat was thinly veiled. If she spoke to Trace Xavier about her situation, there would be consequences. "I have no intention of discussing my private affairs with strangers," Mabel assured him. Warner studied her face for a long moment. "See that you remember that. You're dismissed." Climbing the back stairs to her small room above the saloon, Mabel's mind whirled with questions. Why would someone like Thomas Xavier take an interest in her situation? And more puzzlingly, why did Warner seem concerned about it? Her room, another generous provision that added to her debt, was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest for her few belongings. The window overlooked the alley behind the saloon, offering a view of nothing but the back of the mercantile across the way. Mabel changed into her nightdress and sat on the edge of her bed, taking out the small journal she kept hidden in a slit in her mattress. In it, she maintained her own accounting of her debt and payments, of futile exercise, perhaps, but one that helped her maintain some sense of control over her life. By her calculations, she should have paid off her original debt of $300, the amount Warner had given her father to cover his gambling losses before he'd abandoned her in Concordia more than 2 years ago. But somehow, The number kept growing instead of shrinking. She'd long ago accepted that she might never escape the Silverado. But tonight, for the first time in years, a tiny spark of something dangerously close to hope had ignited within her. The way Xavier had looked at her, had questioned her situation, it suggested possibilities she hardly dared contemplate. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of wide open spaces and freedom, interspersed with Warner's laughing face and the sound of a ledger snapping shut like a steel trap. Morning brought the usual routine, helping cook, prepare breakfast for the saloon's handful of overnight lodgers, cleaning the main room, and restocking the bar for the evening ahead. Mabel moved through these tasks automatically, her mind still occupied with thoughts of the stranger who had shown such unexpected interest in her. Just past noon, as she was polishing glasses behind the bar, the batwing doors swung open. Xavier stood framed in the entrance, his tall figure silhouetted against the bright Texas sunlight. Removing his hat, he approached the bar with the same unhurried confidence he'd shown the previous night. "Afternoon, Miss Nolan," he greeted her, setting his hat on the bar. "Might I trouble you for some coffee if you have it?" "Of course, Mr. Xavier," Mabel replied, turning to the pot that perpetually simmered on the small stove behind the bar. "Black, please." She poured the coffee into a thick mug and placed it before him, acutely aware that they were alone in the saloon apart from Cook working in the back kitchen. "Quiet at this hour," Trace observed, sipping his coffee. "It usually is. Most men are working until sundown." "And Mr. Warner?" "Is he about?" Mabel shook her head. "He's gone to San Antonio for supplies. Won't be back until tomorrow." Something in Trace's expression shifted at this information. "Then perhaps we can speak freely." Mabel tensed. "Mr. Xavier, I don't know what you're suggesting, but I know about your situation, Miss Nolan," he interrupted gently. "I know that Warner is holding you in debt bondage. I know that whatever you supposedly owe him has been manufactured through creative accounting and outright fraud." Mabel's heart began to race. No one had ever spoken so directly about her circumstances before. Most people in Concordia either didn't know, didn't care, or benefited too much from Warner's operations to question his methods. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. Trace took another sip of his coffee before answering. "Because Elijah Warner has done this before, in other towns, with other young women. It's one of several enterprises that has brought him to the attention of people I represent." "And who exactly do you represent, Mr. Xavier?" Mabel asked, caution overtaking her momentary candor. "Officially, the First National Bank of Boston, which has interests in the railroad planned to run through Concordia. Unofficially," he leaned forward slightly, "I represent justice for those who haven't been able to obtain it through conventional means." Mabel stared at him, trying to determine if he was sincere or if this was some elaborate trap set by Warner to test her loyalty. "What is it you want from me?" she asked finally. "Information," Trace replied. "Warner keeps records of his various enterprises, not just this saloon, but his other, less savory business interests. I need to find those records." "And why would I help you with that?" "Even if what you say about Warner is true, what guarantee do I have that you're any better?" A slow smile spread across Trace's face. "A fair question. I can offer you something Warner never will weigh out. Help me and I'll pay off your debt, all of it. Whatever figure Warner claims you owe, I'll settle it in full." Mabel felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Freedom, actual, legitimate freedom, dangled before her like a mirage. She dreamed of escape for years, but had never seen a path to it that didn't involve running away and living in constant fear of being found. "Why would you do that?" she asked, suspicion warring with desperate hope. Because it's the right thing to do, Trace said simply. And because the information you can provide will help bring down a man who has hurt many people beyond yourself. Mabel glanced toward the kitchen to make sure Cook wasn't within earshot. What exactly would I need to do? Tell me everything you know about Warner's operation. Who his associates are, where he keeps his important documents, what his routines are. And when the time comes, provide testimony about your own experience. The request seemed straightforward enough, but Mabel knew the dangers all too well. If Warner suspects I've helped you, he won't get the chance, Trace assured her. Once I have what I need, things will move quickly. You'll be free of him permanently. Mabel studied Thomas Xavier's face, searching for any sign of deception. His blue eyes held steady, meeting her gaze without wavering. I need time to think, she said finally. Trace nodded, understanding in his expression. Of course. I'll be staying at the Concordia Hotel, room 204 if you decide to talk further. He finished his coffee and stood, placing a silver dollar on the bar far more than the coffee was worth. That's too much, Mabel said, pushing the coin back toward him. Trace covered her hand with his own, the brief contact sending an unexpected warmth through her. Keep it. Consider it a down payment on your future. After he'd gone, Mabel slipped the silver dollar into her pocket, its weight both tangible and symbolic, a down payment on her future. The phrase echoed in her mind as she continued her work, wondering if she dared believe in such a possibility. The afternoon passed slowly, each minute stretching as Mabel weighed her options. Help Thomas Xavier and risk Warner's wrath if things went wrong, or continue in her bondage for years to come. The choice seemed obvious when framed that way, yet years of caution and fear made her hesitate. By evening, the saloon had filled with its usual clientele, cowhands from nearby ranches, townspeople looking for diversion, travelers passing through. Mabel moved among them with practiced efficiency, serving drinks, deflecting unwanted advances, and keeping a watchful eye on potential trouble. Thomas Xavier did not return that night, for which she was both disappointed and relieved. She needed more time to consider his offer, to determine whether she could trust him with not only information about Warner but, essentially, with her life. After closing time, alone in her room, Mabel made her decision. The risk of helping Xavier was great, but the certainty of her current situation was unbearable. Tomorrow, when Warner was still away, she would go to the Concordia Hotel and tell Xavier everything she knew. Sleep came easier that night, though her dreams were filled with ledgers that turned into birds and flew away, leaving her standing in an open field under a boundless sky. Morning arrived with a brilliant October sunrise that painted the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Mabel completed her chores quickly, telling Cook she needed to visit the mercantile for personal items, a rare but not unprecedented request that earned her merely a disinterested nod. The Concordia Hotel stood at the opposite end of Main Street from the Silverado Saloon, a 3-story structure that represented the town's aspirations rather than its current reality. Built in anticipation of the railroad's arrival, it boasted amenities that attracted the wealthier sort of traveler who occasionally passed through. Mabel entered through the side door, hoping to avoid the curious eyes of the desk clerk, who would certainly report her visit to Warner. The second-floor hallway was empty as she made her way to room 204, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the walls. She knocked softly, then more firmly when there was no response. Silence greeted her. Thomas Xavier was not there. Disappointment and anxiety warred within her as she considered her options. Should she leave a note? Wait. Return to the saloon and hope for another opportunity? As she stood deliberating, A door opened further down the hall. Trace emerged from room 210, dressed in a clean shirt and vest, his hair damp as if from a recent bath. He stopped short when he saw her. "Miss Nolan," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I wasn't expecting you." Confusion furrowed Mabel's brow. "You told me you were in room 204. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "A precaution. I never give out my actual room number to anyone I'm not absolutely certain I can trust." He glanced around the empty hallway. "Please come in." He held the door open, and after a moment's hesitation, Mabel entered. The room was modestly furnished but clean, with a bed, a writing desk, and 2 chairs near the window that overlooked Main Street. A worn leather saddlebag lay open on the bed, and papers were spread across the desk in neat stacks. "I've made my decision," Mabel said, standing rigidly just inside the door. "I'll help you, but I need your word that when this is over, my debt will be paid and I'll be free to leave Concordia." Trace gestured to one of the chairs. "Please sit. And yes, you have my word. Once Warner is dealt with, you'll be free to go wherever you wish with no obligations to anyone." Mabel sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Trace said, taking the seat opposite her. "Start at the beginning. How did you come to be in Warner's employ?" The story spilled out of her how her father, a widowed cattle broker with a gambling problem, had brought her to Concordia when she was 17. How he'd lost heavily at Warner's tables, then borrowed money he couldn't repay. How Warner had suggested that Mabel work at the saloon to pay off the debt while her father went to secure funds from associates in Dallas. "He never came back," Mabel said, the old pain still evident in her voice. "I waited for weeks, expecting him to return with the money or at least with an explanation. Eventually, I received a letter from San Antonio. He'd taken a riverboat to New Orleans and was heading to California to start fresh. He wrote that I was in good hands with Mr. Warner and that working would build my character." Trace's expression darkened. "And Warner used this abandonment to his advantage." Mabel nodded. "The original debt was $300. I calculated that with fair wages, I could have paid it off in less than a year. But there were always additional costs: room and board, clothing, breakages I supposedly caused, customers who left without paying their tabs during my shifts. And no matter how much you worked, the debt grew instead of shrinking," Trace finished for her. "Exactly. At first, I thought I was doing something wrong, that if I just worked harder, was more careful, I could get ahead of it. It took me nearly 2 years to realize the truth that Warner had no intention of ever letting me go." Trace leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Has he done this to others? There was a girl before me, Lily. She'd been here 3 years when I arrived. Warner said she'd run off with a cattle driver, but some of the older customers let slip that there'd been trouble, that she'd threatened to expose Warner's scheme. No one's heard from her since. And the current girls, Mary, for instance." Mabel shook her head. "Mary and the others aren't in the same situation. They're paid normally, not well, but they get their wages and keep their tips. Warner seems to prefer having just one girl at a time in this particular arrangement. Because it's easier to control one desperate person than several," Trace mused. "Now, tell me about his other businesses. I know he has interests beyond the saloon." "He owns the livery stable and has a partnership in the freight company that serves the surrounding ranches. He also lends money not just for gambling debts, but to ranchers who need to tide themselves over between cattle sales, merchants who want to expand their inventory, that sort of thing." "At what interest rates?" "Excessive ones. I've overheard enough to know that many borrowers end up forfeiting property or businesses when they can't repay the loans." Trace nodded, as if this confirmed information he already had. "And his records? Where does he keep documentation of these transactions? He has a ledger for the saloon that he keeps in his office, but the other business records those he keeps in a safe behind a false panel in his bedroom at the house. You've seen this safe, Mabel nodded. Once, when he sent me to his home to retrieve some documents. He didn't realize I saw him open the panel. You know the combination? No, but I know where he keeps it written down. There's a small Bible on his bedside table. The combination is recorded on the flyleaf, disguised as a scripture reference. Trace raised an eyebrow, impressed. You're observant. I've had to be, Mabel replied simply. What about associates? Does Warner have partners in his enterprises, or is he a lone operator? He works primarily alone, but he has connections with people in San Antonio and Dallas, men who send certain opportunities his way. And there's Sheriff Donovan, who turns a blind eye to Warner's methods in exchange for regular payments. Trace made notes as she spoke, his handwriting quick and precise. This is extremely helpful, Miss Nolan. With this information, we can begin building a case against Warner that will stand up to legal scrutiny. How long will that take? Mabel asked, anxiety creeping back into her voice. Not long. I've been gathering evidence from other towns where Warner has operated. Your testimony is the final piece we need. Once we access those records in his safe, we'll have everything required to move against him. And my debt, you promised, will be paid in full, Trace assured her. In fact, I'm prepared to give you the money now as a show of good faith. When Warner returns tomorrow, you can present it to him and demand a signed receipt acknowledging that your obligation is fulfilled. He stood and moved to his saddlebag, extracting a leather pouch that clinked heavily as he placed it on the table between them. $1,500. More than enough to cover whatever fictional sum Warner claims you owe. Mabel stared at the pouch, unable to believe that freedom could be contained in something so small. I can't accept this. It's too much, and you have no guarantee that I'll continue to help you once my debt is paid. Trace smiled, the expression warming his eyes. I'm a good judge of character, Miss Nolan. I believe in your integrity. Besides, once you're free of Warner's hold, you'll be able to testify against him without fear of reprisal. Hesitantly, Mabel reached for the pouch, its weight substantial in her palm. I don't know how I can ever repay you for this. Your assistance in bringing Warner to justice is payment enough. He paused, then added more softly, though I would count it a personal privilege if you would consider staying in Concordia until this matter is resolved. Your testimony will be crucial when the time comes. The request seemed reasonable enough, though Mabel had imagined that once free, she would leave Concordia immediately, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the memories of her captivity. How long would I need to stay? She asked. A few weeks at most. Once Warner is arrested, legal proceedings will move quickly. Trace hesitated, then added, I understand if you're eager to leave this place behind, but I give you my word that you'll be under my protection for the duration. Something in his tone made Mabel look up sharply. The intensity in his gaze suggested concerns beyond professional interest in her testimony. Is there something you're not telling me, Mr. Xavier? Trace sighed, running a hand through his hair. Warner is a dangerous man, Miss Nolan. When he realizes what's happening, he may lash out at those he believes have betrayed him. I would rest easier knowing you were somewhere I could ensure your safety. The warning sent a chill through Mabel. She'd always known Warner was capable of violence, had seen hints of it in the way he dealt with troublesome customers or competitors, but she'd never directly crossed him before. Where would I stay? I can't remain at the saloon once I've paid my debt. There's a respectable boarding house on Pine Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Hollister. I've already spoken with her about a possible room for you. Mabel raised an eyebrow. You were quite confident I would agree to help you. Hopeful, not confident, Trace corrected with a slight smile. I've learned it's best to have arrangements in place for various possibilities. Mabel considered her options. Staying in Concordia meant facing Warner daily, knowing that she was working against him. But leaving meant abandoning the chance to see him brought to justice not just for her own sake, but for Lily's, and for all the others he had exploited. Very well, she said finally. I'll stay until Warner is dealt with, but I have a condition of my own. Name it. When this is over, I want passage to San Francisco. I have an aunt there, my mother's sister. I've written to her over the years, though I've never told her the full truth of my situation. She's offered me a place with her family many times. Trace nodded without hesitation. Consider it done. I'll purchase the tickets myself as soon as Warner is in custody. Mabel tucked the pouch of money into her dress pocket, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. Tomorrow, she would confront Warner with it, demand her freedom, and take the first steps toward a new life. The thought was exhilarating and frightening in equal measure. I should go, she said, rising from her chair. Cook will be wondering where I am, and I don't want to arouse suspicion. Trace stood as well. Of course. Be careful, Miss Nolan. Say nothing of our arrangement to anyone. Act as you normally would until Warner returns. At the door, Mabel paused, turning back to face him. Why are you really doing this, Mr. Xavier? It can't simply be for the bank or the railroad. For a moment, Trace's composed expression faltered, revealing something raw beneath. Let's just say I've seen what men like Warner can do when their power goes unchecked. The bank's interests align with my personal ones in this case. There was more to the story, Mabel was certain, but she didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their private pain. She, of all people, understood the need to keep certain wounds hidden. Until tomorrow, then, she said, slipping out into the hallway. Until tomorrow, Trace echoed, watching her go with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. The walk back to the Silverado seemed both longer and shorter than usual. Mabel's steps were light with the promise of freedom, yet heavy with the knowledge of the confrontation to come. The money in her pocket bounced gently against her hip with each step, a tangible reminder that everything was about to change. Cook barely acknowledged her return, too busy preparing for the evening meal to question her extended absence. Mabel moved through her afternoon duties mechanically, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. What if Warner refused to acknowledge the payment? What if he became violent when challenged? What if Thomas Xavier wasn't who he claimed to be? By evening, the familiar rhythm of the saloon had settled her nerves somewhat. The routine was comforting in its predictability, pouring drinks, making small talk with regulars, keeping track of tabs. Thomas Xavier didn't appear, which was probably wise. His absence meant Warner wouldn't connect them when he returned. The night passed without incident, and Mabel retired to her small room with the leather pouch tucked safely beneath her mattress. Sleep was elusive, her mind too full of what the morning would bring. When she did finally drift off, her dreams were a confused jumble of ledgers, open doors, and Thomas Xavier's steady blue eyes. Warner returned shortly before noon the next day, arriving in a cloud of dust and self-importance as his carriage pulled up in front of the saloon. Mabel watched from the window as he directed the unloading of supplies, barking orders at the delivery boys and making a show of his return for anyone watching. When he entered the saloon, he glanced around with the proprietary air of a man surveying his kingdom. Everything in order, Mabel? Yes, Mr. Warner. It was a quiet evening. He nodded absently, already moving toward his office. Good. Bring me a whiskey and the receipts from last night. Mabel drew a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. This was at the moment she'd rehearsed in her mind throughout the sleepless night. "Actually, Mr. Warner, I need to speak with you about an important matter." Warner paused, turning to look at her with mild surprise. Mabel rarely initiated conversations with him, and never with such directness. "Oh, what matter is that?" "It's regarding my debt," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I'd like to settle it in full." For a moment, Warner's expression remained neutral. Then he laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "And how exactly do you propose to do that? Has some wealthy admirer left you a fortune I'm unaware of?" "Something like that," Mabel replied, reaching into her pocket for the leather pouch. She placed it on the bar between them. $1,500, more than enough to cover what I owe by any fair accounting." Warner's laughter died abruptly. He stared at the pouch, then at Mabel, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you get this money? Does it matter? It's good currency, and it's enough to pay what I owe you." "I want a signed receipt acknowledging that my debt is paid in full, and that I'm free to leave your employ." Warner made no move to touch the pouch. Instead, he studied Mabel's face with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential prey. "It matters very much. No saloon girl comes by this kind of money honestly. Have you been stealing from me, Mabel?" "No, Mr. Warner. The money was given to me by someone who knows of my situation and wished to help me." "Someone," Warner repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Would this someone be Thomas Xavier by any chance?" Mabel fought to keep her expression neutral, but something must have shown in her face because Warner's eyes hardened. "I thought as much," he said. "What did you tell him about me, Mabel? What lies have you been spreading?" "No lies," Mabel insisted. "I told him the truth that I've been working to pay off a debt for 5 years, and somehow that debt keeps growing instead of shrinking." Warner's hand moved with startling speed, grabbing Mabel's wrist with bruising force. "You stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you've done? Xavier isn't some noble rescuer. He's here to destroy everything I've built, and you've just handed him the ammunition to do it." Mabel tried to pull away, but Warner's grip tightened painfully. "Let go of me. I've done nothing wrong. I'm simply paying a legitimate debt." "There is nothing legitimate about this money or how you came by it," Warner snarled. "Xavier is using you. Once he gets what he wants, he'll discard you just like your father did." The comparison to her father stung, but Mabel refused to show it. "Take the money, Mr. Warner. Give me a receipt, and our business will be concluded." Warner's eyes glittered with a malice that sent fear coursing through her. "Our business is far from concluded, my dear. In fact, I think we need to recalculate your debt. It seems I've been too lenient in my accounting." He released her wrist and picked up the pouch, weighing it in his hand. $1,500, a substantial sum. "Unfortunately, it won't cover the new expenses I've just remembered." "What new expenses?" Mabel demanded, rubbing her wrist where red marks were already forming. "Well, there's the matter of defamation," Warner said, his tone almost conversational now. "Spreading lies about your employer carries significant financial penalties. Then there's breach of contract. You agreed to work exclusively for me until your debt was paid. Yet you've clearly been negotiating with Xavier behind my back. And let's not forget the emotional distress you've caused me with this betrayal." Mabel stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Those aren't real debts." "They're as real as I say they are," Warner replied coldly. "And by my new calculations, you now owe me an additional $3,000. That's absurd. No court would uphold such claims." Warner's laugh was ugly. "What court, Mabel?" "The one where Sheriff Donovan presides, who happens to be my close friend and business associate. Or perhaps you think the territorial judge who stays in my hotel whenever he's in town, would be sympathetic to a saloon girl's complaints. Despair threatened to overwhelm Mabel as the trap closed around her once more. She had been naive to think that simply presenting the money would secure her freedom. Warner controlled too much in Concordia, had too many allies in positions of power. "Now," Warner continued, pocketing the pouch, "since you're so eager to discuss business matters, let's talk about your new duties. I think it's time you took on additional responsibilities that might help you pay off this substantial debt more quickly." The implication was clear, and Mabel felt bile rise in her throat. "I won't do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You will do exactly as I say," Warner hissed, leaning closer, "or I'll have Sheriff Donovan arrest you for theft. $1,500 is more than enough to send you to prison for years." "But it's my money." "Prove it," Warner challenged. "Prove where it came from, how you earned it. I think we both know that's a story you don't want to tell in open court." The full hopelessness of her situation crashed down on Mabel. She had exchanged one form of bondage for another, potentially worse one, and she had dragged Thomas Xavier into her mess without achieving anything. "I need time to consider my options," she said finally, fighting to keep her voice steady. Warner's smile was cold. "Take all the time you need. But understand this, you're not leaving the Silverado. In fact, I don't think you should leave my sight at all for the foreseeable future. You'll be moving into my house tonight, where I can keep a closer eye on you." "Your house?" Mabel echoed, alarm sharpening her voice. "Indeed. It's time we formalized our arrangement, don't you think? A respectable position as my housekeeper will do wonders for your reputation in town. And for mine, since certain rumors have been circulating thanks to your conversations with Xavier." Mabel knew that housekeeper was merely a convenient fiction. Once under Warner's roof, isolated from any potential allies, she would be completely at his mercy. "This is kidnapping," she said, desperation making her reckless. "You can't force me to live in your house." "I'm not forcing anything," Warner replied smoothly. "I'm offering you a choice. Come willingly to a respectable position in my household or face arrest for theft and fraud. Which would you prefer?" Before Mabel could answer, the batwing doors swung open. Thomas Xavier stood there, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him, Warner's menacing posture, Mabel's evident distress. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm as he stepped further into the saloon. Warner straightened, his demeanor shifting seamlessly into affable host. "Not at all, Mr. Xavier. Just a minor business disagreement with my employee. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." "Miss Nolan," Trace prompted, his eyes never leaving Warner's face. "Is that an accurate assessment of the situation?" Mabel hesitated, torn between the urge to tell the truth and the fear of Warner's retribution. "Mr. Warner and I were discussing terms of my employment," she said carefully. "I see." Trace moved closer, positioning himself subtly between Mabel and Warner. "And has Mr. Warner accepted the payment you offered for your debt?" Warner's smile tightened. "Ah, so you are the mysterious benefactor. How very gallant." "Unfortunately, Miss Nolan's obligations to me are more complex than she may have represented to you." "I'm sure they are," Trace replied, his tone making it clear he understood exactly what Warner meant. "Perhaps we should discuss these complexities in more detail, in private." The tension between the two men was palpable, like the charged air before a lightning strike. Mabel found herself holding her breath, uncertain what would happen next. Warner broke the silence first. "By all means. My office would be the appropriate place for such a discussion." "Mabel, bring us 2 whiskeys." It was a dismissal, a reminder of her place, but also a momentary reprieve from the immediate threat. Mabel moved to the bar, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the drinks. That won't be necessary, Trace said. Miss Nolan's presence would be helpful, given that her future is what we're discussing. Warner's eyes narrowed, but he nodded stiffly. As you wish. My office, then. Both of you. He turned and strode toward the back of the saloon, clearly expecting them to follow. Trace hung back, placing a reassuring hand briefly on Mabel's arm. "It's going to be all right," he murmured. "I won't let him hurt you." Mabel wished she could believe him, but fear had its claws too deeply embedded in her now. "He took the money but says I owe even more. He's threatening to have me arrested if I don't move into his house as his housekeeper." Anger flashed in Trace's eyes. "That won't happen. Stay close to me." Warner's office was as imposing as the man himself, dark wood paneling, heavy furniture, and the ever-present display of weapons on the wall. He seated himself behind his desk, leaving Mabel and Trace to take the chairs opposite. "Now then," Warner began, steepling his fingers. "Let's discuss Miss Nolan's situation like reasonable men." "Let's," Trace agreed, his posture relaxed but alert. "Miss Nolan came to you with sufficient funds to pay off her alleged debt. Standard business practice would be to accept the payment, provide a receipt, and consider the matter closed." "Standard business practice assumes standard circumstances," Warner countered smoothly. "Miss Nolan's situation is unique. She's been under my care since she was 17, abandoned by her father with significant debts. I've provided room, board, clothing, and employment when she had nowhere else to go. Such extensive support creates obligations beyond mere financial debt." "Obligations like forced labor and debt peonage?" Trace asked, his voice hardening. "Those are federal crimes, Mr. Warner." Warner waved a dismissive hand. "Dramatic accusations without foundation. Miss Nolan has been free to leave at any time. She chose to stay and work toward repaying her father's debt, which I find commendable. Then you'll have no objection to providing a complete accounting of that debt." Trace reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "I've taken the liberty of preparing a formal receipt acknowledging payment in full. All it requires is your signature." Warner made no move to take the document. "As I explained to Miss Nolan, there have been some recalculations. The current sum owed is significantly higher than what she presented." "How convenient," Trace said dryly. "And I suppose you have documentation of these additional charges?" "Of course." Warner pulled his ledger from a drawer and flipped it open. "Everything is recorded here in detail." "A ledger that only you maintain, with entries that only you control," Trace noted. "That hardly constitutes objective evidence." Warner's facade of civility began to crack. "I don't need to justify my business practices to you, Xavier. Your interest in Miss Nolan's affairs is inappropriate and unwelcome. On the contrary, I find it entirely appropriate to intervene when I witness exploitation and illegal activity." Trace leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Let me be clear, Warner. I know exactly what you've been doing, not just to Miss Nolan, but to numerous others across 3 counties. I know about the loan sharking, the protection rackets, the tampering with local officials. And I know about Lily Harmon." Warner went very still at the mention of the name. "I don't know who you're talking about." "Lily Harmon," Trace repeated. "The young woman who worked for you before Miss Nolan. The one who threatened to expose your operations and then conveniently disappeared. The one whose remains were found in Coyote Canyon last month." Mabel gasped, the confirmation of her worst fears about Lily's fate hitting her like a physical blow. Warner's expression remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Whatever happened to that unfortunate girl had nothing to do with me." "The territorial marshal's office disagrees," Trace said. "They're very interested in the evidence I've been gathering. evidence that Miss Nolan can now substantiate with her first-hand testimony. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Warner's eyes. "You're bluffing. You have nothing concrete, or you would have acted already." "Why do you think I'm here in Concordia, Warner? This isn't a bluff, it's the end game." Trace's voice was steady, confident. "Accept the payment for Miss Nolan's debt. Sign the receipt, and perhaps we can discuss terms that might mitigate your eventual sentencing." Warner's hand moved suddenly toward his desk drawer, but Trace was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and aimed it at Warner's chest. "Don't," he warned quietly. Warner froze, then slowly raised his hands. "You would draw on an unarmed man. What happened to due process, Xavier?" "The same due process you offered Lily Harmon." Trace kept his weapon trained on Warner. "Miss Nolan, please step behind me." Mabel obeyed, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The confrontation was escalating dangerously, and she had no idea how it would end. "This is absurd," Warner said, though the confidence had drained from his voice. "You can't prove anything." "It will be your word against mine, and I own this town." "Not anymore," Trace replied. "While you were in San Antonio, federal marshals were interviewing your associates in Dallas and Austin. Several have already agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. Your empire is crumbling, Warner." Something shifted in Warner's expression, the desperate calculation of a man seeing his options rapidly diminishing. "What do you want?" "I told you. Sign the receipt acknowledging that Miss Nolan's debt is paid in full. Then we'll discuss your surrender to proper authorities." Warner's laugh was bitter. "Surrender? You must think me a fool. Even if what you say is true, I have no intention of spending the rest of my life in prison." "That's not your decision to make," Trace said flatly. "Sign the receipt." For a long moment, Warner remained motionless, his eyes darting between Trace's steady gun and Mabel's pale face. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached for the document on his desk. "Fine. I'll sign your precious receipt." He scrawled his signature across the bottom of the page, then pushed it toward Trace. Satisfied, now Miss Nolan is free of her imagined bondage. Trace kept his gun trained on Warner as he retrieved the document with his free hand, passing it back to Mabel without taking his eyes off the saloon owner. "Check it," he instructed her. Mabel examined the receipt. Warner's signature was there, acknowledging payment in full for all debts owed. A wave of dizzying relief washed over her. After 5 years, she was officially free. "It's signed," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Trace said. "Now, Mr. Warner, we're going to walk out of here calmly. You're going to come with us to the Marshal's office in—" He never finished the sentence. With a sudden violent movement, Warner swept his arm across the desk, sending the heavy ledger flying at Trace's face. In the split second of distraction, Warner lunged for the display case on the wall, grabbing a pistol. "Look out!" Mabel screamed as Warner wheeled around, weapon raised. 2 shots thundered in the confined space of the office, the sound deafening. Warner staggered backward, a look of surprise crossing his face as red blossomed on his chest. He collapsed heavily against the wall, the pistol dropping from his fingers unfired. Smoke curled from the barrel of Trace's revolver as he moved swiftly to check Warner. Mabel stood frozen, the signed receipt clutched in her trembling hand, as Trace knelt beside the fallen man. "Is he?" She couldn't bring herself to complete the question. Trace nodded grimly. "He's gone." He holstered his weapon and turned to Mabel, concern etched on his features. "Are you all right?" The question seemed absurd given the circumstances, yet Mabel found herself nodding mechanically. "Yes, no, I don't know." Her legs suddenly felt unable to support her weight and she sank into the nearest chair. "What happens now?" Before Trace could answer, the office door burst open. Sheriff Donovan stood in the doorway, his own gun drawn, taking in the scene with widening eyes. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, his gaze fixing on Warner's body. "Self-defense," Trace replied calmly, straightening to his full height. "Warner drew on me after I confronted him about his illegal activities." Donovan's eyes narrowed. "And I'm supposed to take your word for that. Step away from him, Xavier." "Sheriff, I can vouch for Mr. Xavier," Mabel said, finding her voice despite her shock. "Mr. Warner attacked first. He was going to shoot us both." Donovan barely spared her a glance. "The testimony of Warner's whore doesn't carry much weight, girl." Trace's expression hardened. "Watch your language, Sheriff. Miss Nolan is a free woman and a witness to Warner's crimes you've been complicit in for years." "You're making serious accusations, stranger," Donovan growled, his finger tightening on the trigger of his pistol. "Not accusations. Facts." Trace reached slowly into his jacket, careful to telegraph his movements. "I have a federal marshal's badge and documentation of an ongoing investigation into Warner's operations, including your role in them." He withdrew a folded leather wallet and flipped it open to reveal a silver star. "Thomas Xavier, Deputy U.S. Marshal. I've been undercover investigating Warner and his associates for months. The shots you heard were fired in the line of duty when a suspect resisted arrest." Donovan's face drained of color. "You're lying. Warner would have known if a marshal was in town." "Which is precisely why I didn't announce myself," Trace replied. "Now, you have two choices, Donovan. You can lower your weapon and cooperate with my investigation, possibly earning yourself some leniency, or you can follow Warner's example and die a fool's death." For a tense moment, Donovan's gun remained leveled at Trace. Then, with a muttered curse, he lowered it. "What do you want? First, secure this crime scene. Then gather your deputies. We have arrests to make." The next hours passed in a blur for Mabel. The saloon was closed, crime scene secured, and Warner's body removed. Trace Marshal Xavier, as she now knew him, conducted a thorough search of Warner's office and private quarters, recovering documents that he said would be crucial evidence against Warner's associates. Mabel provided a detailed statement about the shooting and about her years of debt bondage under Warner's control. Throughout it all, Trace remained nearby, his steady presence a reassuring anchor amid the chaos. As evening fell, Trace escorted Mabel to Mrs. Hollister's boarding house as planned. The widow welcomed her with surprising warmth, showing her to a clean, comfortable room that felt luxurious after years in her cramped quarters above the saloon. "I've arranged for your things to be brought over," Trace told her as they stood in the modest but pleasant room. "And I've spoken with Mrs. Hollister. Your stay here is paid for through the end of the month, by which time all legal matters should be concluded." Mabel sat on the edge of the bed, still dazed by the day's events. "I can't believe he's dead. After so many years of fearing him, it's hard to accept that he's just gone." Trace pulled up the room's single chair sitting across from her. "I understand. It will take time to process everything that's happened." "You're really a marshal," Mabel said, studying his face with new understanding. "That's why you were so interested in Warner's operations." "Yes, I've been tracking Warner for nearly a year, building a case against him and his network. Your testimony was the final piece I needed. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" Trace sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "I couldn't risk compromising the investigation. The fewer people who knew my true identity, the safer everyone was. But you gave me that money. You offered to pay my debt before you had Warner's confession or access to his records." "Yes, I did." His blue eyes met hers directly. "That wasn't strictly part of my official duties." Then why? A shadow passed over his face. Because 5 years ago, in a town much like this one, there was another young woman trapped in circumstances similar to yours. Her name was Catherine. She was my sister. Mabel's breath caught. What happened to her? She didn't survive her captivity, Trace said quietly. By the time I tracked her down, it was too late. That's why I became a marshal, to ensure that what happened to Catherine wouldn't happen to others. I'm so sorry, Mabel whispered, understanding now the personal mission that drove him. When I learned about your situation, I couldn't stand by and wait for the legal process to run its course. I wanted you free immediately, regardless of how the case against Warner proceeded. His admission touched Mabel deeply. Despite his deception about his identity, his concern for her welfare had been genuine. What happens now? She asked. To Warner's associates, to me. Several arrests have already been made, including Donovan. Others will follow as we process Warner's records. As for you. Trace paused, his expression softening. You're free, Mabel, truly free. The money I gave you is yours to keep restitution for what Warner stole from you. And as promised, I'll arrange passage to San Francisco once everything is settled here. Freedom. After so many years of bondage, the concept was almost too big to grasp. Mabel looked down at her hands, noticing with surprise that they were steady despite the turmoil of her emotions. I need time, she said finally. Time to understand what being free really means. Of course, Trace agreed. You have all the time you need. He rose to leave, pausing at the door. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be easier. After he'd gone, Mabel moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening streets of Concordia. For the first time in 5 years, she watched night fall as a free woman, with no debts, no obligations, and no master controlling her fate. The sensation was dizzying, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. The following days brought a flurry of activity to Concordia. Additional marshals arrived to help process evidence and transport prisoners. Warner's network of corruption began to unravel as associates turned against each other, each seeking to save themselves by offering testimony against the others. Through it all, Mabel found herself drawn to Trace not just out of gratitude, but out of genuine admiration for his integrity, his compassion, and his unwavering pursuit of justice. He, in turn, sought her company whenever his duties permitted, sharing meals at the boarding house or taking evening walks along Concordia's quiet streets. 2 weeks after Warner's death, as they sat on Mrs. Hollister's front porch watching the sunset, Trace handed Mabel an envelope. Your ticket to San Francisco, he said. The stage leaves on Tuesday. It will connect with the railroad at Fort Worth, and from there, it's a direct route west. Mabel took the envelope, running her fingers over the thick paper. Thank you. I've also included a letter of introduction to a friend at the First National Bank of San Francisco. He'll help you establish an account for your funds and can recommend legitimate investment opportunities if you're interested. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. You've thought of everything. I've tried to, Trace admitted. I want to be sure you have every opportunity for a fresh start. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the last rays of sunlight fade from the western horizon. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the plains. Will you be returning east when your work here is done? Mabel asked finally, voicing the question that had been on her mind for days. Trace shook his head. No, my next assignment is in Arizona territory. There's a similar operation we're investigating in Tucson. More people like Warner, unfortunately. Yes, the West is full of men who prey on the vulnerable. It's my job to stop them. The nobility of his mission stood in stark contrast to the self-serving cruelty of men like Warner. Yet Mabel couldn't help but worry about the dangers he faced, the solitary nature of his life. "It must be a lonely existence," she observed softly. Trace turned to look at her, something unspoken in his eyes. "It has been, but it's the path I chose after Catherine's death." "And if you could choose a different path now?" The question hung between them, laden with implications neither had yet voiced aloud. Trace's gaze intensified, searching her face as if looking for something vital. "Mabel, he stopped, seeming to struggle with his words, unusual for a man normally so articulate. "These past weeks, getting to know you, it's made me question things I thought were settled." Hope fluttered in Mabel's chest, fragile but persistent. "What things?" "Whether justice is enough. Whether pursuing Warner's kind across the territories will ever fill the emptiness Catherine's death left behind." His hand moved to cover hers on the porch railing. "Whether I'm meant to continue alone." The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading through Mabel. For so long, physical contact had been something to endure or avoid a patron's unwelcome advance, Warner's threatening grip. But Trace's touch awakened something different, something she had almost forgotten existed. "You don't have to be alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Trace's fingers tightened around hers. "I have no right to ask you to delay your journey to San Francisco. You've earned your freedom, your chance to start anew away from all these painful memories." "Perhaps starting anew doesn't necessarily mean leaving everything behind," Mabel suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. "Perhaps it means choosing what to keep and what to let go." Hope kindled in Trace's eyes. "What would you choose to keep, Mabel?" She turned her hand beneath his, intertwining their fingers. "The man who gave me back my freedom. The man who saw me as a person worth saving when everyone else saw only a saloon girl in debt." Trace's other hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "I saw much more than that from the first moment. I saw courage, intelligence, and a spirit that refused to be broken despite years of hardship." The tenderness in his voice, in his touch, melted something that had been frozen within Mabel since the day her father abandoned her. She leaned slightly into his palm, allowing herself to accept the affection it offered. "What about Tucson?" she asked. "Your assignment, it can wait a few weeks," Trace said. "And afterward? Well, Arizona Territory is as good a place as any to start a new life. If that's something you might consider." The implication was clear, and Mabel's heart quickened at the possibility he was suggesting. "Are you asking me to accompany you to Arizona, Marshal Xavier?" A smile warmed his face, reaching all the way to his eyes. "I'm asking for the privilege of courting you properly, Miss Nolan. To see if what I feel for you, what I hope you might feel for me, could grow into something lasting." In that moment, the full measure of her freedom became clear to Mabel. It wasn't just about being released from Warner's debt or leaving Concordia behind. It was about having choices, real choices, for the first time in years. "I think," she said slowly, a smile spreading across her face, "that Arizona sounds like an excellent place to begin again." Trace's answering smile was radiant. With gentle deliberation, he leaned forward, pausing just shy of her lips to give her time to withdraw if she wished. Instead, Mabel closed the remaining distance between them, sealing their new understanding with a kiss that held all the promise of the future stretching before them. 6 months later, under the vast azure sky of the Arizona Territory, Mabel Nolan became Mabel Xavier in a simple ceremony at Tucson's small church. The handful of guests included several of Trace's fellow marshals and, to Mabel's joyful surprise, her aunt from San Francisco, who had traveled to witness her niece's happiness. Their home was modest but comfortable, a small ranch house on the outskirts of Tucson, with enough land for the horses Trace loved and the garden Mabel had always dreamed of planting. While Trace continued his work with the Marshal's service, Mabel found her own calling teaching at the local school, using her experiences to help children, especially girls, understand their worth and potential. On their first anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching the spectacular colors of an Arizona sunset paint the desert landscape, Trace presented Mabel with a small leather-bound book. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the simple cover. "Open it," he urged, an unusual nervousness in his expression. Inside, Mabel found page after page filled with newspaper clippings, court documents, and handwritten notes, all chronicling the dismantling of Warner's network and the conviction of his associates. "The last of them was sentenced last week," Trace explained. 20 years in federal prison for his role in the operation. "It's over, Mabel. Every single person connected to Warner's crimes has been brought to justice." Tears filled Mabel's eyes as she turned the pages, reading the accounts of justice served, seeing the names of men who had enabled Warner's reign of terror now facing the consequences of their actions. "This is why you've been traveling so much these past few months," she realized. "You were making sure they all faced trial." Trace nodded, taking her hand. "I made you a promise that day in Warner's office. Justice for you, for Lily, for all the others who suffered under his control. I needed to keep that promise." Mabel leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as emotion overwhelmed her. "Thank you for never giving up, for seeing it through to the end." "There's one more thing," Trace said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small velvet pouch and placed it in her palm. "I found this among Warner's personal effects during the investigation. It rightfully belongs to you." Puzzled, Mabel opened the pouch and tipped its contents into her hand. A delicate gold locket on a fine chain slid out, the metal warm against her skin. With trembling fingers, she opened it to find a tiny portrait inside, a woman with familiar features and kind eyes. "My mother," she whispered, recognition flooding through her despite the years since her mother's death when Mabel was just 12. "But how?" "I thought all her belongings were lost when Father sold everything before we came west. According to Warner's records, your father left it as partial payment for his debts. Warner kept it, probably intending to sell it eventually." Tears flowed freely down Mabel's cheeks as she clutched the precious memento. "I never thought I'd see her face again." Trace gently wiped away her tears. "Now you have a piece of your past to carry into our future." Mabel closed the locket and let Trace fasten it around her neck, feeling as though a circle had been completed, her past acknowledged and honored, but no longer defining her present or limiting her future. As the last light of day gilded the desert in gold, Mabel turned to her husband with shining eyes. "I have something to tell you too," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently over her abdomen. "Our future is going to include someone else in about 7 months." Trace's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as understanding dawned. "You're certain?" Mabel nodded, joy bubbling through her. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby." With a whoop of delight, Trace gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around before carefully setting her down again, suddenly concerned. "I didn't hurt you, did I? Or the baby?" Mabel laughed, the sound free and light in the evening air. "We're fine. More than fine. We're perfect." Trace pulled her close, his hand still resting protectively over their growing child. "From debt bondage to this," he murmured against her hair. "You've come so far, Mabel Xavier." "We've come far together," she corrected him, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "And we have so much further to go." Their life together would not always be easy. The territories were still wild, justice often hard-won, and the shadows of their respective pasts would occasionally darken even the brightest days. but they faced each challenge together, bound not by debt or obligation, but by a love forged in adversity and tempered by mutual respect and admiration. 7 months later, when their son was born, a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit, they named him James, after Trace's father, with the middle name William in honor of Mabel's. His birth represented everything they had fought for: family, future, and the freedom to build a life on their own terms. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter joined them 2 years after James, followed by twin boys who brought equal measures of joy and chaos to the Xavier household. Mabel's school expanded, eventually becoming the Concordia Academy for girls, named not for the town of her captivity, but for the harmony she had found in her new life, and the hope that future generations of women would never know the bondage she had escaped. Trace eventually left the Marshal service to establish a law practice specializing in cases involving exploitation and injustice. His reputation for integrity and determination made him both respected and feared throughout the territory, and more than one would-be Elijah Warner found their schemes thwarted by Thomas Xavier's vigilant attention. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the desert night wrapped around their home like a protective blanket, Mabel and Trace would sit together on their porch, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars emerge above the landscape they had come to love. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Mabel asked on one such evening, 15 years after they had first met in the Silverado Saloon. "If you hadn't come to Concordia that day, if Warner had succeeded in keeping me trapped," Trace's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes. But then I look at our children, at you, at everything we've built together, and I know that some things are simply meant to be. We were meant to find each other, Mabel." She smiled up at him, the years having added character to her beauty without diminishing it. "From the moment you walked into that saloon and asked for the good stuff, I think some part of me knew my life was about to change forever." "For the better, I hope," Trace said, the familiar twinkle in his eye. "For the best," Mabel corrected him, leaning up to kiss him with the same tenderness that had marked their very first kiss on Mrs. Hollister's porch all those years ago. Above them, a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the velvet darkness, a fitting metaphor, Mabel thought, for her own journey from bondage to freedom, from isolation to love. In Thomas Xavier, she had found not just a rescuer but a partner, not just escape from her past but the promise of a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine during those dark years at the Silverado. And in that moment, under the vast canopy of stars, Mabel Xavier knew with absolute certainty that every step of her difficult path had led exactly where she was meant to be, home, with the man who had paid her debt not just with gold, but with respect, honor, and a love that had only deepened with each passing year.